welcome to this Chatham House event on respecting the referendum result. It's a good question. What Brexit satisfies the democratic will of the people? My name is Arnon Menon from King's College London, and a few announcements to make. Firstly, this event is on the record and is going to be live streamed, and you can comment on Twitter using hashtag #CHEvents if you so wish, but do so on phones that are turned to silent, please, if you can. We've got a fantastic panel to discuss this question, and in the order they're going to speak they are Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of the Secret Intelligence Service, Janet Daly, columnist with the Daily Telegraph, Professor Matthew Goodwin, University of Kent, and finally Antoinette Sandbach, MP for Edisbury. You can find their bios online if you want more details, but I'm keen to kick us off so we can have a decent debate. Sir Richard, over to each speaker is going to speak for a maximum of 8 minutes, which I'm going to police ruthlessly. Sir Richard.
You can't say much in 8 minutes, so I'm just going to make a number of points, and I promised I'd try and do it in less than 8. I mean, my answer to the question, what Brexit satisfies the democratic will of the people, I think that the majority of voters thought they were voting for the repatriation of decision-making to the UK. The phrase used at the time was borders, law and money, but legal, political and economic issues. So I think that would be, first of all, my answer to the primary question. The second point I would make is I think we have a juxtaposition constitutionally of parliamentary democracy and democracy by referendum. My comment in relation to that is I think there have been 11 referenda in the UK, and the result of every single one hitherto has been accepted and regarded largely as non-controversial once given. And I will also remind everybody that all the political parties in Parliament signed up to respect the results of the referendum when it was called by David Cameron. I make no bones about the fact that I hope what may happen in the next 10 days is that President Macron will veto extension beyond the 12th of April. The reason I think this is it will get us out of our current agony, and I don't see any extension delivering a clear political solution. So if we have an extension, the agony just continues, the uncertainty continues, and if we crash out, I would prefer to call it a sovereign Brexit, then we at least have another point of departure politically and take it forward from there. The particular issue that has interested me in the withdrawal document and the political declaration is the issue of national security and, to an extent, defence policy. And I am very surprised by the material which is in the withdrawal agreement in particular, and it is spread like butter through the document. Interestingly, there is no separate section on defence and security. And the reason I am surprised by this is there is within the document a very significant change in UK policy towards the European Union and the Commission in Brussels. It has been UK policy to resist any Brussels involvement in national security and defence issues. That doesn't mean we have openly opposed them, but we have gently from the sides discouraged them, and those that have taken off, we have made sure that we influenced and dominated. I remind you that the UK is the defence, intelligence and security leader of Europe by a very significant margin, and therefore we have called the shots in this particular area. However, within the withdrawal agreement, we have locked ourselves, or appear to be locking ourselves, into continued membership of common security and defence policy. And I do not understand why, without a very significant debate in Parliament, our attitude towards EU defence and security issues has shifted so significantly, because we now find ourselves advocating a closer relationship on defence and security with the European Union, when we were a member having opposed that policy. This hasn't been much advertised or discussed. There's been too much preoccupation with other issues. But I think the national security issue is possibly one of the most serious aspects of the withdrawal agreement and why I so fundamentally disapprove of that policy. The other issue which surprises me enormously is the backstop. And I still cannot get my head around how the UK got itself into this situation on the Northern Irish border. The one thing I would say is that the technology for an open border exists and is very easy to implement. If you can have a traffic charging system in the complexity of London, you can have a technological control of the Irish border. It is not a problem, and I happen to advise the Swiss company, who is the world leader in what's called track and trace, and how track and trace works, I happen to know quite a lot about. This was ruled out by our own government and by the Irish government on no other grounds than apparently political grounds, and therefore we got ourselves into a lock which at the moment it appears we cannot get out of and will lead almost certainly to the demise of the withdrawal agreement. So those were the primary points I wanted to make, particularly emphasizing the national security point. And the final point I would make is that I personally deeply worry about the political and economic future of the European Union. I think it is only a matter of time before there is a euro crisis. The only solution to a crisis with the euro would be fiscal union, and fiscal union requires much closer political union. And Macron, who is advocating that particular policy, has already been rejected by the German government. So it is hard to see where we go from this point on. And I think if there is a eurozone crisis, we will be better outside, and of course we will be heavily influenced. In fact, the eurozone crisis is going to have a much bigger impact on the British economy than Brexit.
Thank you very much. Right on time. Janet.
There has become a prevailing mythology, a persistent myth about the referendum result, obviously reinforced or perpetrated by the Remain camp, and that is that people didn't know what they were voting for. Now, there is a sense, entirely counterproductive to the Remain cause, in which that's true. Many ordinary people who voted Leave did not understand how complex it was going to be to disentangle our relations from the EU. They didn't, in other words, know how deep we were in. To the extent that they have become aware of that, they are deeply shocked. And if anything, it has confirmed their view that we should leave. They had no idea of the extent to which British sovereignty had been lost in the relationship with the EU. But there is also a sense in which, the more important sense, in which that claim is entirely false. Whatever the tangential issues, whatever the marginal concerns were of people, virtually every single person who voted Leave was affirming his belief that he should be governed by people he has elected and whom he can remove if he so chose. Now, given that that precept has been embedded in the Western political consciousness since the 18th century, it's been quite an achievement to have made it controversial. And yet, the Remain camp has not only, to the extent that it's addressed it at all, it has made it a contentious claim, but for the most part, it hasn't even attempted to address it. The most fundamental assumption of the Leave case, that the populations of democratic societies have a historic right to choose those who make their laws and to remove them from power when they see fit. Instead of engaging with this proposition or even attempting to make some sort of persuasive case for dispensing with it, I mean, you could have made an argument that we're in a post-democratic period in history, although that would take quite a lot of nerve. The advocates of Remain simply traduced those who voted for Leave as bigoted know-nothings. The debate that should have dominated national discourse for the last 2.5 years about the integrity of the democratic nation state or the status of our institutions never happened, because the Remain side occupied itself purely with really shockingly vicious slurs against people whose lives and problems were, for the most part, completely unknown to them. The supposed justification for all this vilification was that many Leave voters cited uncontrolled immigration as a reason for voting the way they did. Ergo, all or most Leave voters must be bigoted xenophobes. So I am prepared to take this assertion for once head on. It is not inherently wicked to want to live in a socially homogeneous community. That is a quite natural factor in the human condition. Even the official spokesman for Remain, who spoke in patronizingly sympathetic terms of the left-behind classes in post-industrial Britain, seemed unwilling to come to terms with this basic truth. It's an inclination to live in a socially homogeneous community is an inclination that has been natural for every society that has survived long enough to be recorded. In fact, when the notion of civilization itself arises from cultural identity in which common beliefs and assumptions and values make it possible to live together in a rational way. Of course, as you undoubtedly will occur to you, or you will argue, communities and nations need contact with others to remain alive and to remain vibrant, not to become inbred and inward-looking. But accepting and incorporating outsiders is an important part of this. The history of human progress is a story, to a considerable extent, of the migration of peoples, even when those movements involve invasion or conquest. But that doesn't delegitimize the basic human need to live and to raise one's children among people whose behavior and attitudes are similar enough to one's own to provide cohesion and stability. To demonize this in favor of a relentless cosmopolitanism is quite stupid and unjust. The citizenship of the world, so beloved by utopian European fantasists, might be appealing and possible for a tiny proportion of the world's population. The specially qualified, socially confident, domestically unattached, and rich. But to most of the world's people, rootlessness is not even attractive. Indeed, it would be scarcely bearable, an endless existential insecurity. And I sometimes wonder whether it ever occurs to all the merchants of cosmopolitanism why they find unspoilt provincial backwaters of Europe so delightful as places to have holidays in and to visit. It's because of the confidence that comes from essentially a socially homogeneous community. Just to add a point, a rather personal point, I've never known a time in my life in Britain, and I've been here all my adult life, when public intellectuals have actually suggested that those who hold opinions opposed to theirs should go away and die. I mean, there are commentators who have practically stopped short of eugenics in talking about how it is necessary to move on from these old-fashioned, supposedly xenophobic attitudes. It goes way, way beyond snobbery, which is usually quite good-natured in Britain. It used to be the case that people who did not have your advantages or your privileged education should be treated with sympathy and respect. This was to some extent descended from the aristocratic idea of noblesse oblige. And Project Fear was very much an expression of this contempt and incomprehension. I could not understand for the life of me why politicians like David Cameron and George Osborne, quintessentially British establishment figures, did not understand their own country, the character of their own country. When the British are threatened or bullied, they don't get frightened, they get angry, or they laugh. And they did both, in fact, in response to Project Fear. If the UK cannot leave, just as a final point, if the UK does not succeed in leaving, being the fifth largest economy, having its enormous global influence, its unique relationship with the Five Eyes security network, as Sir Richard referred to, it's inconceivable that any other member state could succeed in leaving. And that means that those other member states, even if we manage to get out, but if we don't manage to get out, that means that they have no hope of bringing about radical reform within the EU, because without the possibility of leaving, there is no leverage for demanding radical reform. And I really fear for the fate of a European Union which is essentially a protectionist bloc, a declining element in the global economy, and seems to be determined ultimately to achieve the kind of political union which would make, as Sir Richard described, fiscal union necessary. Fiscal union means that even your tax and spending policies are not determined by the government you have elected. What would be the point in voting in a general election? Because tax and spending policies are generally the issues that determine who you will vote for in a national election. That seems to be sliding into a kind of modern protectionist empire, which is quite terrifying.
Thank you very much. Matt.
So I think in terms of the question, what Brexit satisfies the democratic will of the people, I think we need to ask two subset questions. The first is why are we here, and the second is what's happening to Britain right now. And in terms of answering the first question, why are we here, I would say that we know exactly why we're here, that we've got now more than a dozen studies showing quite clearly that in very general terms, Leavers were driven by two core concerns. The first is they wanted a greater sense of judicial independence, a restoration of national sovereignty. And the second is that they wanted to slow the pace of immigration, to reform freedom of movement beyond the reforms that David Cameron brought back in early 2016, which were not very significant from the point of view of most voters. Now, all of those studies, whether they've used large-scale surveys, whether they've used qualitative focus groups, have basically all said the same thing, which is those are the two core drivers. But of course, within all of that, there's a whole lot of variation. There's a whole lot of debate to be had among voters about what exact Brexit model they really want. And I remember the day after the referendum, my friend and neighbour, Vernon Bogdanor, whispered into my ear on College Green on the morning of June the 24th, of course, this is the first moment in post-war British history, perhaps the first moment ever in British history, when a majority of people have formally asked for something that a majority of MPs didn't want to give. And in a way, it was always, I think, inevitable that we'd end up here with a political and constitutional crisis. I think it was inevitable. But I think what Vernon missed, and I'd say it if he was here, is that public opinion is not that homogeneous, that even among Leavers, there is a great deal of variety around what type of Brexit deal they want to see. And I actually completely agree with Janet that a lot of our post-2016 debate has completely lost sight of the nuance within the Leave camp, also the Remain camp, by the way. 1 in 3 black and minority ethnic voters opting to leave, liberal Leavers being just as important as those working class Leavers in Stoke. We've not really heard much about graduate Leavers. Some of my students, for example, who voted for Brexit, all the Vox Pops mainly have come from Burnley, Stoke and Clacton. But I do think we have a good grasp now from the research about why we're here. We also now are getting a very good sense of how Brexit is changing our country. And one of the main things there, I think, and Anand and the UK and a Changing Europe have done a lot to promote this, is just how polarised we are becoming. If you look, for example, at a recent YouGov poll, it asks a very interesting question that was imported from the US. The US has seen remarkable progress where over 90% of Americans now say they'd have no problem if their son or daughter married somebody from a different ethnic or racial group. Whereas in the 1950s, over 90% disapproved of that, which goes to show how quickly social change can happen. But they ask a very interesting question, which is, would you mind if your son or daughter married somebody from the other political tribe? And about 50 to 60% of Americans said they'd have a problem with that if their son or daughter married across the political aisle. YouGov, about a month ago, found in the context of the UK that 11% of Leavers would have a problem if their son or daughter married a Remainer. Okay? 37% of Remainers would have a problem if their son or daughter married a Leaver. On one level, I sort of looked at that and thought, that's kind of funny, but actually it matches up with a lot of research that we have, and I think the previous speakers were alluding to, which is that the polarization that we're witnessing, the fact that now 8% of us identify strongly with a political party, but 40% identify with a Brexit identity, I would argue that polarization is skewed actually far more strongly towards Remainers. We now have quite a bit of research showing that liberals, in general, can often be as intolerant as the Conservatives or even the populists that they claim are more intolerant. And I've just run an experiment, you'll find it on my Twitter feed, last week, where we asked Remainers and Leavers a series of questions. Would you mind working with somebody from the other political tribe? Would you mind going on a date with somebody from the other political tribe? Would you mind marrying somebody? Would you mind your child having a relationship with somebody from the other political tribe? And what you consistently find is that Remainers are more anxious about what we would call that social distance, being proximate to somebody with a different ideological view than Leavers. And I think we need to talk about that because I think it's rumbled through our Brexit debate for the last 2.5 years. The reason we haven't had the debate about how to fix our social and economic and political settlement is not only because of that, but I do think it's partly to do with that. I think some of the pieces that we have had around the sort of depiction of kind of Leavers just waiting to die, and we should turn our backs on coastal towns like Clacton, and then wondering why those areas are giving 70% to leave. I do think there are, unfortunately, large and very significant communities that are not that invested in trying to use this moment as an opportunity to address the imbalances within our social, economic and political settlement. And I think we'll come to regret that. The answer to the question of what satisfies the democratic will of the people, what Brexit satisfies, what model of Brexit, my view is we have to have some form of Brexit. But I'm not convinced that we have to have the polarized, extreme versions of Brexit that are being advocated on either side. I'm a pretty boring pragmatist in that I sort of woke up and thought, well, everybody's voted for leave. Let's try and figure out how to make it work. And in that sense, however bad Prime Minister May's deal is, the one thing that I see in surveys is that actually the only thing that unifies Remainers and Leavers today is that they don't really like that deal. But maybe that's the point. Maybe in a way it is a 52-48 outcome. I look at Conservatives and 60-70% are saying they really want a no deal. I look at Remainers and you're seeing similar numbers say they either want to have a super, super soft Mr. Whippy Brexit or overturn and revoke Article 50 altogether. I just don't think in terms of the social settlement where we are, either of those two models are going to be particularly effective at addressing the polarization that we're seeing. As an American colleague said to me last week, you are where we were 10 years ago. I don't particularly want to see British society follow the American model. So I think compromise and consensus, wherever possible, is the way forward.
Thank you. Antoinette.
So I've got the advantage of being the only elected MP on the panel, and I can tell you that I have access to my inbox. I represent just below 80,000 people, and they're all telling me what the will of the people is, and every one of them are suggesting totally contradictory things. And that's why you're seeing a divide in Parliament. MPs are as representative as the people that they're elected to represent, and you are seeing very real divisions in Parliament. But I would argue that the will of the people can and does change. The 2016 referendum is not frozen in aspic, and as time goes on, the reality of Brexit diverges from the dream that was promised, and the case for another vote becomes stronger. We're discussing what Brexit satisfies the democratic will of the people, but given that it's been a year since Leave was ahead in the polls, perhaps the question should be, does Brexit satisfy the democratic will of the people? And I think we should remember that on the ballot paper, the question that was actually asked on the ballot paper was about our membership of the EU, i.e. the EU institutions, and not what form of Brexit should take. The question was, should we remain or leave a member of the EU as its institutions? So I would argue that we just don't know what was in what people had in mind when they voted to leave, and rather than demanding that MPs respect the will of the people or the manifesto, those who do so should try and argue their vision of Brexit on their own merits. And there was a poll that was done a week after the referendum result of leave-only voters, and only 35% of leave voters at that time felt that that meant leaving the single market or the customs union. And I'm sure you'll all remember the different visions of Brexit that were advocated during the campaign. So I don't oppose a no deal because it's not what people were promised, although I don't think it was what people were promised during the referendum. But I oppose it because of the impacts that it will have on my constituents and the material harm that the evidence that I've had as a Member of Parliament sitting on a select committee, taking evidence 5 hours a week for the last 18 months from business, because I sit on the Bays Select Committee, and the impact that that will have on my constituents, I oppose a no deal. And that doesn't mean I oppose Brexit. And I think what was very difficult, and one of the reasons why we're in the space that we're in at the moment, is that there wasn't time taken by the Prime Minister after the referendum result to bring people together and to actually stand back and really look at what were our best options. She never put her negotiating lines to either Parliament or to any, or even to the party. Or to her cabinet. You know, I find it very difficult that people say, well, I stood on a manifesto which said that meant leaving the customs union and the single market, when the manifesto was published after nominations were closed. My postal vote letters had already gone out before the manifesto was published. And actually, in my election literature, I made very clear to my local electorate that what I wanted was a negotiated deal with Europe that meant that we had a positive relationship, and I don't see a no deal about that outcome. So the referendum result is really all about interpretation. And what worries me is that 50 or so Brexiteer MPs are in effect rewriting history about 17.4 million people and how they voted. And I just want to say to Janet, you know, I was on the train coming back from Westminster, and one of my constituents came up to me and said to me, please do something about Brexit, please. I only voted to leave because I wanted to give David Cameron a kicking. And I think it's very dangerous to assume that 17.4 million people all had the same vision or idea of Brexit, and we've never really addressed that. And what you're seeing in Parliament at the moment is the kind of debate that I would argue we should have had back in 2016 about what does it mean to us as a country? What are the best opportunities? What are the trade-offs? We have not had honesty about what the real trade-offs are. And Janet, although I would still argue that being in Europe would be best for my constituents, I absolutely do not want ever closer union. I don't want to be part of some superstate project. I would argue that Europe is becoming more democratic, not less, because of the co-decision making that is now being given to the European Parliament and the ideas of subsidiarity. And I absolutely do not want fiscal union. I do not want to be part of the Euro project, but I think we are dealing with a global world that has massive issues like climate change, where our voice is stronger in a bloc when we are looking at the rise of China and an increasingly, what I would call difficult United States. And we really need to work and cooperate together. And I don't see that as a subjugation of national authority, I think there is a way of having Brexit, or a way of influencing how we remain, if we end up remaining, and I'm not sure that we will, that means that we don't have what I would regard as a narrow, isolationist, no-deal Brexit that will have massive consequences for my constituents. So where are we going to go? I really have no idea. But if Parliament retains the paralysis that it currently has, then I would argue we are going to have to go back to the people and say, this is the Brexit that has been negotiated. This is the option on the table. And maybe, you need to decide whether you want to leave. And the Vote Leave campaign, as I said earlier, didn't promise a particular outcome. And it really deeply concerns me that no-deal Brexit is being advocated as the outcome that was being voted for.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. You've done it in half an hour, which is superb. When I read out my speaker's notes at the start, I forgot the most important sentence, which is the chair has prerogative. So the chair is now going to abuse that prerogative and ask a couple of questions himself before I turn to you lot. Quite specific ones in some cases. I mean, to you, Sir Richard, I suppose my question would be, you say the technology exists, but there isn't a single border in the world that's run with this sort of technology. Why not, if the technology exists? For you, Janet, a very specific question, because I imagine we'll get questions on this, but let's be clear. What does socially homogeneous mean? I wasn't quite clear. I mean, I'll ask the questions and let you all answer. I mean, Matt, we read the same research. I've got less in the way of questions for you, but you ended on this rather warm and fuzzy note that we should have come together and got. Can anyone agree on anything? I mean, where is everyone says, oh, if she'd sought consensus, we'd have found it. Where is that consensus? And the final question, I suppose, for you, Antoinette, is: you do, I imagine, accept the fact that, because you hinted at us remaining in, if we overturn the first referendum without implementing it, won't that cause enormous problems politically in this country? So there we go. That's just to kick you off. If you want to start off, Sir Richard.
Well, I would argue that borders pretty much are sui generis. I mean, they are very different depending on where you are and what their purpose is. Mm-hmm. The Irish border is a pretty unique and unusual construct. I mean, it exists in terms of tax already, but there's no, physical separation, so you can drive back and forth. I mean, just as, I used to live on the French-Swiss border. You similarly there can drive back and forth. But there are certain controls which can be exercised, usually by physical posts. Now, we know for political reasons, physical posts are impractical on that particular border because of its complexity, the number of roads that cross it, the farms in the middle of it, all this sort of stuff. But on the other hand, the track and trace technology is largely not used for border control. It's used for fiscal control and for collection of excise or excised goods in the majority of cases. So it's a new application to a cross-border situation of a technology that's hitherto used for something different, but it's absolutely ideal for the Irish border in terms of, system of trusted traders who have to apply, and you can then, exercise whatever control you like. The other point to make is, what is it, 1% of the UK's GDP goes across that border? I mean, it's financially pretty irrelevant. This has been made into a political issue for the sake of the Irish government. The Irish pulled off a massive coup in Brussels. But I mean, it's completely anomalous. Let's say you're a Lithuanian.
If we must, okay.
For the defence of Europe, you are largely dependent on the UK's contribution if you have a problem with Russia. And yet you're saying to the Lithuanian government, hold the British government to ransom, which is what Brussels are doing, over the Irish backstop, when the Lithuanians haven't got a clue what the issue is about because they've never been historically involved in Ireland. What I'm saying is the anomalies that we've managed to inject into the situation are stunning, absolutely stunning. And they could have been solved from day one by taking a technology which is highly sophisticated, which is used, for example, to collect tax in Brazil on carbonated drinks. Think of the complexity of that issue.
Actually, I'm going to fight the urge to argue. When you answer your...
Can I just
Go on.
ask, because that's fine for goods, but what about phytosanitary checks? The biggest barriers are non-tariff barriers. They are the checks that have to be conducted at borders. And the Northern Ireland Select Committee did a report to Parliament saying there is no technology that deals with the Irish border. Now, I accept that it may come, and I do accept that, but we have to have a model that deals with the issue around regulation as well as the flow of goods and people.
Sir Richard, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought.
Right.
We're going to finish, because I want to turn to the audience as soon as possible. But Janet, if you just want to explain socially homogeneous to me quickly.
Of course, socially homogeneous isn't a specific paradigm. It's a vague term. What I'm talking about is the everyday experience that every honest person has of the fact that there are particularly provincial parts of Europe in which families have lived for 10 and 12 generations. There are working class communities in Britain in which there is, at least since pre-war, between the wars periods, communities that have grown up with assumptions about behavior and codes of behavior which they feel comfortable with. Nobody is saying that everyone should be averse to allowing outsiders or foreigners or foreign communities. It's a question of whether people in communities which very often are already tremendously economically disadvantaged discover that they cannot get a place in a primary school because of an influx of migrants, or because of that influx of immigration, at least more than half of the children in that primary school don't speak English as a first language. This is not an urban myth. These are real problems.
When you say socially, you mean culturally homogeneous?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Matt.
Okay.
Where do voters agree, Remainers, Leavers? So they all agree that the government is managing Brexit terribly. They all agree that Prime Minister May is doing a really bad job. They all agree that they don't feel, 90%, 80 to 90% agree that they're not represented by the main parties and they'd like somebody else to vote for. And remarkably, today, large majorities of them agreed in saying that they don't know who the de facto Deputy Prime Minister is, David Lidington. They don't know who the former Brexit Minister, Dominic Raab, is. And they 65% don't know who the Foreign Secretary is, Jeremy Hunt. Yet somehow we've convinced ourselves into thinking that actually what we really should give the electorate is a highly complex three-way referendum which will somehow make complete sense because everybody will suddenly understand what WTO is, what Chequers is, what May's deal is versus what Remain is. So I think, we have to remember that a month ago, 50% of this country didn't know what the customs union was, right? So we need to be sensitive to the level of public knowledge around the specifics. Having said that, they all, Leavers at least, agreed on the broad thrust of what they wanted, and that thrust, I think, is really important. So it all comes down to the question, to answer you, Anand, is what are you willing to concede? If you're a Remainer, what are you willing to concede? If you're a Leaver, what are you willing to concede? If your answer to that question is nothing, then we have more polarisation. And I'll be back here in 5 years and we'll have a panel about how populism is back on fire in the UK and why is Tommy Robinson an MEP. I mean, seriously. I know right now for a fact in Westminster there are people who are seriously organised about campaigning for a European Parliament election. And the funny thing is, if we have a second referendum or a European Parliament election, it won't even be about Europe. It will be about trust, and it will be about Parliament, and we will unleash something that will make this episode look fairly tame by comparison. So I do think we need to ask that question, what are we willing to concede? And that's why fairly boring and say, actually, I think May's deal, for all of its faults, probably gets us into that area where we all have to just make a bit of a concession and go on with that.
Okay. Antoinette, I can't remember what I asked you now.
So as someone who's voted for May's deal 3 times, even though I still hold my personal belief that we should remain, I have voted for May's deal 3 times to try and honour that promise that I gave to my constituents to respect the referendum result. The problem is I have seen it be struck down by people who have an ideologically pure Brexit that they want to achieve. And that really concerns me, because that it is a small number. Now, 28 ERG MPs in the Conservative Party, plus 6 or so Remain MPs that are absolutely determined to vote for nothing but a second referendum. And you know, the reality is that I've had to completely change my way of life. I live under constant death threats. I have to have security at home. You have already, this referendum already unleashed that bottle. That has the identification with political parties is gone now. And I see that again in my constituency. People are now identifying, and I agree with the research from what I see in my postbox and I've been running my own surveys in my constituency. I put an online survey up last week, just before the indicative votes, and 63% of those who didn't vote in my constituency in the referendum would now vote Remain. I see people that are very polarised between no deal and Remain, or revoke Article 50. But there is a willingness to compromise, and I think the big failing, in a way, is not... I think it's been very encouraging what's been happening in Parliament over the last few weeks, where MPs have so-called seized the order paper, because you're now seeing dialogue about the trade-offs. How can we resolve this? Can we reach a consensus and compromise that maybe people don't like? And I accept, you know, I don't care whether it's May's deal, Common Market 2.0, the Customs Union. I have voted for them all to try and deliver a Brexit. But my absolute red line is no deal, because I have a duty to put my the constituents first. And on the evidence that I have seen, I simply cannot support that. And therefore, I will vote for every reasonable alternative. But if we cannot agree in Westminster, what other alternative is there? And I'm afraid most MPs do say that it will have to go, the majority in Parliament at the moment has been to take no deal off the table. Now, practically and constitutionally, can you do that? We will see where things go. But, you know, there is already that massive polarisation, and the 48% feel that the closeness of the result was not recognised, that the attempt to try and negotiate something that reflected that and to perhaps take some of the best elements of our relationship with Europe has not properly been identified. And that's why I have voted for May's deal, because I think although it's not a perfect deal, it is a compromise that allows us to go out. But if Parliament is being blocked on that by a small minority of MPs, then I think we have to look at another solution. And to me, for the very reasons that Matthew has identified, a general election is not the answer. Labour is split on this equally to the Conservatives. So it's just not the answer. If you want an answer on Europe, you're going to have to go back with a specific question.
Right, over to you lot. Using my prerogative, keep the questions short, and I'm not going to ask all 4 of the panellists to answer each one, so we can get as many in as possible. So the gentleman back there at the back.
Thank you. Vincent Champion, journalist and private Chatham House member. Why doesn't someone call the backstop out? I mean, politically, no one would ever put a hard border in. I mean, how many divisions has Mr. Juncker got?
Anyone want to? Do you want
So
to?
Richard, I'd like to respond to that. It was contrived. The whole Irish border question was contrived, and it was done at the instigation, I'm afraid, of some very influential Remainers. There were people who were had been particularly involved in the Good Friday Agreement, in the Belfast Agreement, who saw the opportunity to create an immovable obstacle, and who are staunch Remainers, and who, according to the information I have, really helped to instigate the creation of that problem.
Antoinette?
We have international treaty obligations under the Good Friday Agreement that we need to comply with, and the suggestion that we can just write those off is just nonsense. That's the first question. And secondly, I don't see it as calling it out. I see it as a genuine difficulty, but it's been blown out of proportion, I would argue, by the DUP and actually the ERG to create an obstacle, because the chances of that being there, the backstop ever being used, are remote. Yes. The aim of both parties is to try and get a negotiated agreement. And let's not forget who signed up to the backstop. The joint agreement that came back in December 2016 was signed off by Boris Johnson and David Davis. 2 Brexiteers were put in charge of that joint agreement, and they came back having signed up to it. And it was presented to Parliament as the agreement that had been struck by the government. And so to suggest it's some kind of Remain conspiracy is frankly laughable.
Gentleman there in the middle, I think, was next.
Thank you. Simeon Boltev. I'm a student at King's College London, political economy. I wanted perhaps to direct my question to Sir Richard. With the United States having a more domestic approach, the population of Africa swiftly increasing, and the Chinese getting a bigger influence within Eastern Europe economically and I would even say security-wise. Does the United Kingdom think perhaps the European Union would have a security threat within those capacities, and would the United Kingdom be cooperating in regards to intelligence with the European Union in case of a no-deal Brexit? Thank you.
Well, my own view, professionally, on a no-deal Brexit is that it wouldn't change anything in terms of the bilateral exchanges that we have with the 27 member states. So most of the sensitive material that is exchanged is done bilaterally. It is not done through the European Commission. So removing the European Commission, as it were, from the equation makes no difference. I mean, it has been the UK's policy, not publicly sort of stated, but I mean, maybe it's worth stating now, to make sure that the EU did not sort of interfere in the UK's national sovereignty. And for example, when the Lisbon Treaty was drafted, I personally went round most of the major European governments asking them for their agreement to cross out the references that were put in the European Constitution, which of course was not ratified, to national security, because the UK didn't want it there. Most of the larger member states agreed with us, with the exception of Germany, but in the end they were under pressure to take it out too. But I'm just using that as an illustration of where our stance was. I mean, I think one has to draw a distinction on defence and security from leaving the EU. And we're not leaving Europe. We're not abandoning our relationships in Europe. I mean, our closest partner after the United States on defence and security issues is France. And that relationship, although sort of marred by the tension of the Brexit negotiations, is in very, very good shape. You know, we help the French in terms of their deployment of troops against Islamist jihadis in Francophone Africa. I give you many, many examples of the sort of close cooperation. So, I think one needs to think down a slightly separate channel because, the UK has only ever been a skin-deep member of the European Union. That's the truth of British policy. Okay, bits of the British government were much more enthusiastic Europeans than our politicians were. This is one of the problems that we have. The Foreign Office has been totally Europeanized, in its mentality, and it never really reflected the reluctance that a number of our ministers, both Labour and Conservative, always felt about the EU. And, we have always resisted political integration, strongly resisted political integration. And the reason that, we were so supportive of enlargement was we knew that if the EU was extended to 27 members, it could never take any political decisions. And, we were horrendously successful. In a way, we shot ourselves in the foot on this issue.
And what sort of shape would Anglo-French relations be in if President Macron does what you want him to do and forces no deal on us?
I think we'll be very pleased.
Yes. We'll all be happy.
Okay.
I think he's resolving a political blockage that we're incapable of resolving ourselves. And okay, I'm not arguing with a brilliant constituency MP who feels a strong responsibility, which not enough MPs feel, towards your electors, and I think that's great. But we took a massive political risk in having a referendum. We voted out. We're not. I think what I find so shocking is we're not now prepared to face that risk.
We are, but I don't think...
We are, but under controlled and managed circumstances.
The deal that's been negotiated is keeping us essentially, spiritually and mentally, inside the European Union. It is not a clean break. Now, Mervyn King the other day said, our political classes are suffering a nervous breakdown. I think that we've got no confidence in ourselves and our ability to face a tricky future.
Okay,
And this has been a fault line in British politics ever since I've been a government servant. And I started in 1966.
Anita Panwani, Independent Risk Advisor. I take your point on the political aspect, but what about the economic, social, financial aspects? We have leaders in industry saying clearly they have no political agenda, that they're leaving. Ford was on this morning saying we're leaving, we're closing down.
Political decision. I'm not saying we took
But we now know we're closer to the actual event, and from a risk-based perspective, we have more information. But on a day when the head of the civil service is warning of the potential negative impacts when we're so close.
I'm fascinated by that. Yeah. Why has he done it?
Because that's what the civil service is telling him.
I don't think that's why he's done it. Because if he's wrong, it doesn't matter. And if he's right, and there's a government inquiry, he can say, I warned you.
So can I say, Sir Richard, I am elected, and I would go for the Burkean philosophy that I'm elected to exercise my judgment. And when I'm looking at the chemicals sector in the northwest, 21% of UK's chemical sector is in the northwest. AstraZeneca, who've spent millions of pounds trying to mitigate some of the consequences of a no deal that could have gone into medical research. The aerospace industry, the nuclear industry, car manufacturing industry, these are high-paid, highly skilled jobs in the northwest. I think it's the UK Independent Trade Policy Observatory has estimated 83,000 job losses in the northwest. Yes, we've taken a political decision, but that should not be sacrificed for the purity of a no-deal Brexit because it's a clean break. Actually, we need to be explaining the trade-offs, and that's why I've supported a Norway-style agreement or a customs-style agreement. Manufacturing firms do not want to manufacture to different regulatory standards. They want to be able to make one product and sell that product to the largest possible market that they can access with the least friction possible. And a no deal is simply catastrophic for my constituents. And that's why I draw my red line there. I'm happy to compromise in all sorts of other ways. You know, with Norway, we can get agriculture back, fisheries back, crime and justice. We could go into an arrangement that takes us very easily out of the withdrawal agreement. The withdrawal agreement is just the terms on which we're leaving. It is not the terms of our future relationship. And it will be superseded by our future relationship. So I really think that politicians are not being open and honest with the electorate. And maybe we're not being given the chance to be, because it's all about sound bites, and it's all about, I'm on this little hill and I'm going to wave my flag because I'm a PVer or I'm a ERG member and I want to leave means leave Brexit. And we actually have to be much more pragmatic. People look at us now and say, what has happened to the United Kingdom? Where is your reputation for pragmatism and for compromise? And I really think within Parliament, forget our negotiation outside, we need to find that spirit of pragmatism and compromise and get a deal over the line.
You're accusing people of simply sloganeering. I spend an awful lot of time listening to the people who argue in defense of no deal, and the projections that are being made by very strong vested interests, corporate vested interests, don't necessarily have to be taken absolutely at face value. Just as the prognostications of the original Project Fear, part of the difficulty is that the public simply doesn't believe a word that's said to them now, because they were told that millions of jobs were going to be lost, the economy was going to crash as soon as we voted leave in the referendum.
Why is consumer spending declining then?
Wages are up. Employment is up.
If the public are supremely unconcerned...
No, they're not unconcerned.
Oh, so they do believe them?
No, the uncertainty certainly is causing reductions in spending and reductions in investment. The uncertainty is the issue. And even the businesses you're describing are saying that it's the uncertainty that is the real difficulty. It's not a question of assuming what will happen after a particular outcome. It's the not knowing what that outcome is. So even though employment is up, unemployment is at an all-time record low, and wages are up, and economic growth is better than it is in the European Union, people are not spending because of the uncertainty.
If the population were to be reassured that we're having no deal, they'd start spending again?
No, I don't think so, because apparently, according to the latest polls, no deal is now the most popular outcome.
No, but what I'm saying is, you seem to be implying that the people don't believe the forecast and so are unconcerned. No. I'm saying no. That was confusion. No, the people are concerned about the lack of certainty, about the fact that we seem to be in a kind of purgatorial vacuum. But they're not. It's not that they are worried about a specific outcome like no deal. In fact, they now favor no deal. And I'm afraid, although I advocated in print that people did vote for Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, her withdrawal agreement is the least popular option. So, you know, but it's a question of not knowing what is going to happen rather than fearing the consequences of some particular outcome. Okay, thanks. The gentleman's been waiting back in the middle. And if we can be quick, we can get one more in before 7.
Hi, David Skidmore. Just to throw a hand grenade into this, surely the best answer would be, A, for the country to crash out, and then hand the responsibility of sorting it out thereafter to the father of the House, Ken Clarke, because I think the entire country would actually welcome Ken Clarke coming in as a Prime Minister across the political divide. Try that for size.
Does anyone want to comment? I'm quite keen to take one more question from a woman, if I may, as the last question, and all the hands go down. Anyone? They're all men. Okay. In which case, this gentleman at the front has been waiting for... Did I? And then we'll have the lady standing at the back, sorry. We'll do them one after the other and then answer them both, I think.
My name is Harry Blaney. I am a retired U.S. diplomat, served at our missions to the European community, and also served at U.S. NATO and the policy planning staff in the White House. But I started my life really studying here in Britain the debate taking place of joining in 1964, of joining the then the European communities. I have watched the...
I'm sorry, we're really running short of time.
I know that. I have watched what is taking place now, and I've come from a place that depressed me, and I am now seeing a place that is depressing me even more. This debate, not only in the Parliament, but also on this stage, has demonstrated the inability and the sadness of people who have a particular perspective, but not, as we used to say in America with respect to Trump, not dealing with the facts. There were a lot of things that were said here by almost everyone except our fine representative of the House of Commons that seems to me to have been inaccurate about this debate. I would like to ask the final, if you would, question is what does the word forward mean, and why has not the only option that Britain can take that is for its future security interests and for its economic interests and for its relationship with America? I take exception to the idea that if Britain were to leave Europe, that America's relationship with Britain in the same level would take place again.
Brilliant, thank you. Lady at the...
Hi, I'll try to be quick, but I was just really interested in what Professor Goodwin, you said at the beginning about social distance, because it's something I've seen anecdotally, but I've never heard quantified with those statistics. My question is, do you think that's something that's happened and grown since the vote? And if so, what do you think has caused that change?
Do you want to answer?
Well, on the specific issue of the relationship between Europe and the United States, including the UK, I would say that the defence of Europe, depends on NATO, and that talk of a European army is a total waste of time unless Germany were significantly to change its policy on defence expenditure. I believe firmly in the, as it were, revival, as it happens. Putin's done us a good turn. NATO is much revived. Trump has got one thing right, maybe by accident, but his demand that Germany increases its defence expenditure from 1.3 to 2% of GDP is exactly correct. We should not be expecting the Americans to pay for European defence. We must pay for our own defence.
The question is, leaving the European Union will harm our relationship with the United States, I think.
I totally disagree. I think if we return to the mid-Atlantic, it will strengthen it.
Matt, you're going to get the last word.
Yeah. Is against the unity of Europe and the Western democracies.
So we're just going to have to move on, I'm afraid, because we are, in fact, over time. But Matt,
so just one of the things that I've found remarkable about the Brexit debate since the referendum is actually how little we've still talked about what is happening in Europe, what is happening elsewhere around the world. Our debate has been incredibly insular. It's been really parochial. We've just not looked up, put our heads above the parapet and looked around. And that will come back and bite some people if we do end up having a second referendum. The economy is in a fragile place, absolutely, but we have to remember that the counterpoint at which voters are using is, well, what would life be like if we were in the EU? Now, if you believe life is going to be better in the EU, you've got to start making that case, because at the moment, very few people are making that case. And this is an important one. As we go into European Parliament elections at Chatham House and we talk a lot about international events, I'm sorry, but I think the counterpoint for most voters is not a good one. We've got populists in Italy, rule of law issues in Hungary, Poland, Romania. We've got a slowing, not very productive Eurozone economy. We've got much of Central and Eastern Europe depopulating over the next 20 years. And this is a debate I think we actually need to have, more so than what does London want?
Matt, can you answer the question from the back?
And the question, sorry, about social distance, it links into the comment here because it was quite interesting. You had a little pop at us and I'll have a little pop at you in return. When I was mentioning the academic studies about why Leavers voted for Leave, you were nodding your head and saying you disagreed with me. That is, I suspect, because they didn't fit your view of the Leave vote. But they're quite clear, all peer-reviewed research, all pretty robust. What we don't know is whether this stuff has been increasing over time since the referendum. What we do know is that we've got very significant social distance between Leavers and Remainers, and that Remainers are consistently a little bit more likely than Leavers to say they don't really want to hang out with people that have different views to their own, right? And that's a problem. That's a really big problem. The way forward, by the way, is citizens' assemblies. I'm convinced of it. That's the way forward. We've got to stick everyone in the room together, lock the doors, and nobody can leave until we've compromised.
Well, on that bombshell, I've screwed up, I'm afraid. I've let us overrun by 5 minutes, so you'll never see me chair an event here again. But just for the moment, let me thank our fantastic panel. Let me thank you all and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Thank you so much.